Welcome everybody to our last session in the research seminar series on blockchain. I'm Alex Preda. I'm convening this series in collaboration with colleagues from the law school, Dixon Poole School of Law, and from the Department of Informatics and Computer Science here at King's College London. Today's talk given by Bill Maurer from the University of California at Irvine closes our series for this term, and we are going to reconvene with a new program and new speakers from January 2022. And Bill's talk today is about sovereigns, cooperatives, public, central bank digital currencies as a debate over intermediation. I'm assuming that I don't need to introduce Bill in very many words because he's so well known for his work on money, anthropological work on money. And just to say a few things, Bill is Dean of the School of Social Sciences. Is that still correct, Bill? You're still That's Dean, right? Dean of the School of Social Sciences and Professor of Anthropology, Criminology, Law and Society at the University of California, Irvine. And he's one of the world's leading experts on money from a social science perspective, money as artifacts and technological systems. And at the UC Irvine, he directs the Institute for Money, Technology and Financial Inclusion, as well as the Filene Center of Excellence for Financial Technology. So currently, he's conducting research on AI in consumer financial services and on social relations between human and artificial agents, data cooperatives and data governance, as well as blockchain technology and law. He's a fellow of several learned societies, among them the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And he has served also on the board of Behavioral, Cognitive, and Sensory Science of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. This being said, welcome, Bill. It's a great pleasure to have you here as our guest, online guest. We would have loved to have you in person, but we all know about the ongoing restrictions and constraints when it comes to international travel. So hoping for better times when we will be able to welcome you in person in London. Over to you, and thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. We know that it's early morning at your end, it's afternoon at ours, and we are very excited about your talk.
Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you so much for that warm introduction and for having me in your blockchain seminar. I understand this is the very end of it, so hopefully this will be a nice capstone and maybe not too insane a talk. Because this is going to be a little bit of an insane talk. I kind of took this opportunity to pull together some reflections on blockchain and situate them in the context of the rest of my work. So it's, you know, a little weird, but here we go. My decade plus research on fintech, money, blockchain, and payment infrastructures has led to a few core insights, which I just want to open with. And the chief one is that payment is political. The act of value transfer, using your Visa card, using Venmo, is a political act. The seemingly neutral infrastructures facilitating value exchange in contemporary capitalism are the product of political decisions that themselves constrain debate, and they constrain that debate along already worn tracks. And not just debate about money, but about all kinds of things: gender, race, politics, morality. This is one of my favorite maps, actually. This is a map from the 1940s by the Federal Reserve of the states that would not clear paper checks at their face value. And the Fed sort of stamped out that practice. What I enjoy sharing, why I enjoy sharing this map is, if you know the history of the United States, the banks that in the states that weren't clearing checks at their face value almost exactly maps onto the old Confederacy. And there's reasons for that, which we can talk about if anybody cares. But this is what I mean by saying that payment is political and not just about money, but about all kinds of things. Payment is interesting to me because it also reveals the limitations of dominant and critical perspectives on capitalism. What this means is that payment systems generally operate according to non-capitalist principles and are priced outside the market. Or another way to put this is that in order to explain the pricing of payment, how much it costs a market participant to use a particular payment infrastructure like cash or the Visa network or Bitcoin, you need to engage in what Michel Calon and Vincent Lepine would call Ptolemaic correction. Calon and Lepine are critical of, quote, the cautious researchers who were content to correct the Ptolemaic system of the pure and perfect market by adding to it a multitude of epicycles turning in all directions: contracts, trust, information, rules, norms, coalitions, unquote. In other words, you need to add all these crazy epicycles like Ptolemy did to his geocentric model of the universe and how the planets and sun and everything else supposedly revolved around the earth. You have to add all of those to our neoclassical models of pricing in order to explain the price of payment, how much it costs a merchant to accept a credit card payment, for instance. Or instead of all those epicycles, you can just be Jean Tirole, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on pricing in payment in multi-party systems, in which he demonstrated competition tends to raise prices, not lower them the way that you would expect in a neoclassical model. And also the price that any individual user gets charged is different from that paid by other users, which again, isn't supposed to happen in the models of capitalism that we are accustomed to. Credit card system experts, Evans and Schlemansky, follow Tirole when they write, quote, interchange, right, the price on a card transaction in this case. Interchange is not an ordinary market price, unquote, right? And then they just kind of leave it at that. So if it's not a price, what is it? For me, what's interesting about that is that it really kind of shows the limits of the way we approach capitalist economies presented by people like Karl Marx and Milton Friedman alike, and shows how this is a diagram from J.K. Gibbs and Graham, the economic geographers, shows how we really need to think and attend to that articulation between what we call capitalism and what we could call non-capitalist relations in trying to understand payment. Is this, how do we solve this analytical problem? In anthropology, there's all kinds of ways people have approached this. Claude Mayetsu talked about the articulation of different modes of production, the way that colonial forms of capitalist extraction linked up with kinship relationships in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. Anna Singh talks about salvage capitalism. Sylvia Yangi-Sacco talks about heterogeneous capitalist practices. And Gibbs and Graham, of course, talk about the proliferation of modes of production, moonlighting, barter, friend exchanges, producer cooperatives, underneath the waterline, so to speak, of what we see when we see wage labor for our capitalist market and firms and such above that waterline. Oops. There. I have always argued that this relationship between capitalist and non-capitalist systems is more like a shift in phase, an alternating current, not an other that's over there somewhere else. But the same phenomenon in one instance can be something else in another instance in a moment in time, the way that your current and your AC goes back and forth between phases and switches direction when you plug it into the wall and turn on the light switch. For me, the kind of normative and emancipatory trick here is to get one phase to linger a little longer than the others, a little longer than the ones that we've resigned ourselves to or accustomed ourselves to. And I've argued that getting into the infrastructures of payment can help with that, because the infrastructures of payment, again, are not strictly governed by capitalist logic, but originate in systems that were state-made, like state-issued currency, state-mandated, like a lot of our interbank clearing systems. In the UK, you've got Pay.UK. In the US, we have the automated clearinghouse. Or they originated in co-ops, and everybody always forgets this, but the Visa network was initially a non-joint stock company that was run as a cooperative before it became a publicly traded company. So kind of lingering with these in this space a little bit longer, I think, can help us think about the way that changing the infrastructure can open up to some of those other worlds outside of the dominant kind of narratives that we have of capitalism and capitalist price formation in the market. Change the infrastructure, change the world. And that's why I have been studying payments. They're fundamental to the operation of the economy. They're profoundly understudied. And they're interesting because they upend all of these assumptions about how things work. They've also been the site of a lot of experimentation and investment over the past decade and a half. My colleagues and I have called this a Cambrian explosion in payments after kind of the Cambrian explosion on planet Earth, when all of a sudden there were tons of new body forms and pathways among the teachers that were crawling around the planet. We've had that go on since around 2008, with tons of new modalities of payment based on all kinds of different technologies, from optical scanning to near field communication, different kinds of card products and so forth, and of course, Bitcoin. And we can talk about sort of the reasons for this Cambrian explosion after 2008. I generally talk about it in terms of the 3Ds: debit, Durbin, and data breaches. Debit is simply that on both sides of the Atlantic, EU and the US, regulators finally put a cap on the price of using a debit card. Right, there was a cap on that. It was reduced down to just the level that it takes to maintain the infrastructure. So all of a sudden, banks and payment companies lost a ton of revenue and figure out what to do. So there's all this experimentation that create new revenue streams. Durbin is the Durbin Amendment in the United States after the financial crisis that again added consumer protections on forms of payment. And then of course, there were also tons of card data breaches that led the card issuers and the banks to seek new solutions and new secure solutions right at the time when everybody had all of a sudden these mobile phones that themselves had built in high security. But the reason I have this sort of weird map of Nevada here from Mark Twain's novel Roughing It is because what was going on during this period again illustrates the point that payment is this funny thing. Folks weren't building payment infrastructures to make money in any conventional sense. They were doing what was happening with rail lines during the silver boom in the second third of the 19th century in Nevada. Freighting was the business, right? Kind of charging rents and tolls over digital infrastructure was the business. And Mark Twain is kind of making fun of this around silver. He's like, there actually weren't any silver mines. People were fighting to get rights to build these toll roads and to charge for the freight over the road, not actually to get the silver out. And this is the world in which Bitcoin emerged. And you'll recall, and you all probably know this, those of you who are here, that it was launched explicitly as a volley in a long-standing war on the central banks. And references to the bank bailouts were encoded in the very first Bitcoin transaction in the blockchain. And it was a sort of effort to disintermediate traditional financial powerhouses. And this photo is just to sort of show you how far we've come, right? Email, sign up at coinbase.com for $1 of free Bitcoin. This is at a Money 2020 conference in Las Vegas in 2013. 1 year later, just 1 year later, right, the whole format of the conference was reorganized to focus on Bitcoin. And things got a little weird for me, innocent anthropologist who studies payment and money and stuff. I had to learn how to say words like, and I still have a hard time saying them, anarcho-libertarianism or crypto-anarchy. And I interviewed people, oops, not that yet. It's trigger warning, there's gonna be Trump, okay? I interviewed people who would talk about trustlessness and the unalterability of what was essentially a big Excel spreadsheet in the cloud. This co-occurred with the rise of right-wing populism around the world, politicians calling for the reinstatement of the gold standard, and sprawling, confused, yet surprisingly, at least surprisingly to me, durable conspiracy theories linking things we used to take for granted as critics of neoliberalism: free trade, money markets, the use of market models in policymaking, the privatization of everything. Right? We used to be content to be critical of all of that, but all of a sudden we have our anarcho-libertarians and right-wing populists echoing those same criticisms, but then linking it to globalist cabals, refugees, feminism and queer assertion, the mobilization of Black and brown people, and so on. A present day, oh, there's my trustlessness thing. A present day Karl Polanyi might have said, society is pushing back forcefully if sometimes farcically, against the self-regulating market and its excesses. And I just leave this up. This is from The Great Transformation. It's kind of amazing to read Polanyi now, right? And to see what he was talking about at the beginning of the 20th century, which is, I mean, come on, like this is like, this could be describing today. So today, I want to kind of linger a little bit over one simple-ish question, which is, and this will get me to CBDCs, and this will get me to sort of other contemporary alternatives, harking back to my desire to kind of capture additional time space with the alternatives. The question is, why does the cryptocurrency proponent hodl? And y'all probably know what hodling is. Hodling is holding. The term derived from a misspelling in this possibly drunken post in 2013 to a Bitcoin forum when Bitcoin's value was plummeting. And this person posted defiantly, "I am hodling," meaning to say holding. It's come to symbolize the buy and hold mentality of many in the crypto community, which has ultimately propelled speculation and spectacular price rises, as well as basically obviated cryptocurrency's use as a means of payment. Because if everybody's hodling, right, you're not using it to pay. And why pay today in Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever when the value of it will rise tomorrow? If I'm going to buy something, might as well just use Venmo in my Visa card instead of using my, you know, $100 million trillion of Bitcoin, which might be 200 million trillion tomorrow. And I want to focus on this question: why does the cryptocurrency component hodl? Because I think it's diagnostic of a wider network of meanings and associations that intertwine with our populist present. Because we see hodling going on elsewhere in real estate markets that have been contorted by liquidity pumped into economies due to quantitative easing, in the art market for the top 1/10% and so on, but also for many on the bottom who are hoarding physical cash due to negative interest rates, the de facto negative interest rates on savings deposits, right? So you've got the wealthy buying up real estate and hodling. You've got crypto people holding onto their cryptocurrency, but you also have people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder who are withdrawing cash and putting it in the mattress, like see Japan, but also see the United States during the pandemic. I'm not sure what was happening with cash use in the UK during this time. Now, why the hodler hodls became a real concern to central banks during the pandemic. And that concern has only increased because if people are saving, and here I just mean that they're state-issued money, if people are saving and not spending, the consequences of the pandemic's flash freezing of the economy will be that much more unpredictable, right? So the Fed sees hodling of cash and is like, okay, this is not good. Saving is not good right now. Taking out cash and putting it in the mattress is not good right now. We need to get them to spend. Now, I'm intentionally echoing the American literary critic Walter Ben Michaels' question posed to late 19th century literature and political cartoons like this one. Walter Ben Michaels, who's problematic in a bunch of ways, we can talk about that if people want to, but Walter Ben Michaels' question was, why does the miser save? This whole theme of the miser saving was a theme throughout the so-called naturalism movement in fiction, a kind of social scientific extreme realism that frequently explored the themes of economic inequality and the ravages of the financier class. Ben Michaels' exegesis of a constellation of texts revealed the tension between the idea of value, specifically but not exclusively the value of money, a tension between the idea of value as a material thing given in nature or a representation adopted by convention. Is value a thing given in nature based on like natural scarcity of gold or whatever, or is it a representation adopted by convention? Think Locke saying gold is a convention, not a natural thing. This distinction between materiality and representation for this late 19th century literary movement was written as continually in danger of collapsing. And literature of the time reflected contemporaneous debates over the nature of money, gold bugs versus the silver rights in the US, or the gold standard versus the circulation of credit on paper in the British Empire, and the paradox of how something as insubstantial as a promise could hold value and command fortunes. And this is captured in, Thomas Nast's gold bug political cartoons like this one, milk tickets for babies. And you see a doll that is an inflated Humpty Dumpty. This is not a rag baby, but a real baby by act of Congress being handed a milk ticket that says, this is milk by act of Congress. And you see all the rest of the art behind it, including this is money by act of Congress. Faced with this paradox between representation and reality and the continual collapse of the distinction, characters in naturalist fiction huddled. The miser saved. The miser wanted the power to buy, but didn't actually want to use that power for fear of losing it. Spending would release money from its natural essential value, turn gold into the dust of consumerism, and so on. And this idea that gold had value in itself, excuse me for 1 sec. This idea that gold had value in itself and was therefore the best form for money also has, there we go, deep associations with anti-Black racism in the period during and after the American Civil War, as well as European colonial expansion. The constellation of hard money, white supremacy, imperialism, and natural law, the historian Michael O'Malley here interprets as a reaction against, quote, an ethical system which sought to abolish nature itself by declaring rag paper into money and making Blacks the equal of whites, unquote. O'Malley tracks the alignment between 19th century conceptions of specie and species, between support of hard money and state-enforced racial equality. He writes quite, quote, gold bugs tended toward racist ideas because they wanted to stop the promiscuous circulation of goods and peoples and meanings, the negotiation of identities. And O'Malley also writes about how this worked its way back down into how payroll happened, right? So Black soldiers fighting Confederacy were paid in paper dollars. Union soldiers demanded silver or gold. In the construction of the Panama Canal later on, O'Malley writes about how there was a silver roll and a gold roll. So white workers were paid in gold, Black workers were paid in silver. And I also just want to put up this, what do you call it, political ad poster from the Brian McKinley election in the United States in 1896. And you've got the kind of imperial context here as well with the gold standard, right? And the country gone Republican, all the factories will be active, people will be going to the bank, there'll be order in Cuba, and without the gold standard, the factories will idle, there'll be a run on the bank and starving people in Cuba under Spanish rule. The paradox here brings us right up against the miser's problem. If money is given in nature, then any payment of money for goods is not the mediation of values between different goods by money as a medium of exchange, but barter, right? So if money is given in nature, it's hunk of gold for a sack of potatoes, that's not money, that's barter. Ben Michaels writes, quote, the assertion that money exists in nature is thus identical to the assertion that money does not exist at all, unquote. So the miser saves, the hodler hodls. Mediation, which is supposed to be the way capitalist economies function, both symbolically and materially, ceases. This is a world not of disintermediation, but no mediation at all. And if you think I'm talking about NFTs, yes, that is what I'm thinking about and talking about. NFTs make me crazy, right? Because so here I am, an anthropologist of money who's critical of like the idea of fungibility and universal, exchange of everything by the universal equivalent. And yet here's all of a sudden this thing called a non-fungible token. And I'm going to be like, that can't be like in capitalism, people. So come on. The notion of money as a particular kind of sign that can stand for anything, and of money and all things as interchangeable and fungible insofar as they can be measured according to one yardstick of value, rest on a special understanding of signs and symbols. In this rendering, this is after Saussure, obviously the sign is arbitrary. It could be pennies or euros or digital messages or tallies on a piece of wood, all signifying the abstract value of money. And Ferdinand de Saussure made this point clear. It's worth remembering that Saussure's theory of the sign as arbitrary arbitrarily standing for a signified, was developed in conversation with the economics of Vilfredo Pareto. For Saussure, the system of signs, each arbitrary in relation to their signifieds, yet importantly, organized in relation to one another, revealed an underlying structure which should be the proper object for linguistics. For Pareto, similarly, the relations among competitive agents in a marketplace revealed value through price and thereby an underlying structure despite the diversity of forms, forces, and fungible items in the world. And that structure would be the proper object of economics. Cryptocurrency and its latter-day manifestations in things like NFTs belie this arbitrariness, right down to the level of the code. And I think this is really important. Bitcoin transactions, just to take Bitcoin, are structured such that one is not actually transacting digital tokens or assigning them to new owners. It's done through a different kind of process that tries to does preserve the integrity of a specific message plus signature of a certain denomination of value in Bitcoin, which is called an unspent transaction output, or UTXO. When a Bitcoin transaction is always dual. If I want to sort of send Alex some Bitcoin, what's really going on is the algorithm is initiating two transactions, one in the amount of the intended transfer, and the other in the amount of change from this transaction, which is then paid back to the address initiating the transaction. And this is sort of a feature, not a bug, right? This is the thing that makes everything traceable back to the beginning of time, but it also sutures this metaphorical relationship between Bitcoin and a physical world commodity. It makes sense to say that every piece of Bitcoin is unique. It's as if one party has a digital rock, which has to be broken into two pieces in order for one piece of the intended value to be transferred to be given to the other party, and the other piece, the remainder, to get transferred back to the first party. And this is one of the reasons why my colleagues and I have called crypto a kind of digital metalism. And right, this infuses the whole way that people understand this thing, right down to the way that Bitcoin is frequently represented as kind of little gold coins. No one represents Bitcoin as a piece of paper or as that, right? Which is what it is. They represent it as that. This is the logic of literary naturalism. And I argue it's attendant racialization transposed to our digital present. It's not surprising then that, for example, the survivalists in New Hampshire that Finn Brunton interviewed in his research on digital cash transacted both in cryptocurrencies and in old American silver dimes. Silver, not gold. Like if they knew that, the silver right position was actually the soft money position in the 19th century, they'd probably freak out. But to them, silver is silver, the metal is the metal, the weight is the weight. Or that disintermediation, it's also not surprising that disintermediation gets narrated by Bitcoin proponents as burning the whole thing down. This is from one of the overstock.com guys in 2016. Meanwhile, the super rich are busy setting up satellites in space, quite literally to transcend it all with their frozen heads, right? And you just think about all of the folks in crypto and crypto adjacent communities, also written about by Finn Brunton, who were part of that whole cryogenic movement and now the billionaire in space movement. This is also why I think, This is also why I think that you have this kind of revivification of racism, xenophobia, misogynistic, homophobic, and especially anti-trans rhetoric and anti-Semitism co-occurring with digital naturalism. For the future that the transgender person, the Jew, the immigrant, and so on represents is one of dangerous befuddling mediation, introducing the currency that allows fungibility in a world that wants non-fungible permanence qua purity, which is super creepy, right? This is also why we see such interest in and such strong reactions to the prospect of central bank digital currencies. Now, CBDCs were spurred on by Facebook's Libra which didn't really go anywhere, and is now Meta's DM, and the guy behind DM like just left Meta like 3 days ago, but be that as it may, spurred on by these experiments, central bank researchers started seriously exploring design ideas and the monetary policy implications of issuing digital denominations of their fiat currencies. For some, CBDCs would head off the problem of hodling specifically. In a time of negative interest rates, central banks could simply deduct value from people's CBDCs. They would need simultaneously to abolish cash, of course, to prevent people from converting their CBDC into physical currency, to prevent this automatic deduction of value through negative interest rates. And so there's active discussion in some quarters about kind of abolishing cash concurrently with creating a CBDC. In times of crisis, which of course has been on people's minds during the pandemic, alternately, a CBDC would allow central banks, would allow governments through central banks to issue so-called helicopter drops of funds directly into people's accounts. And there was a proposal in the initial CARES Act, the initial Relief Act in the United States at the start of the pandemic, to provide for just this kind of system, given all of the issues that people correctly foresaw in the distribution of aid, especially to un- and underbanked people, right? In the United States, if you had filed your taxes electronically ever and you had a bank account, your relief money just got put into your bank account. If you didn't, you would be sent a debit card or an electronic check. There were all kinds of distribution issues. With a CBDC, no problem, right? If you eliminate cash and everybody has CBDCs, you just helicopter drop the money into people's accounts. But this prospect is also terrifying to those who already view central banks with suspicion, and central banks know this. So in some of the conversations that I was in about this, central bankers were like, yeah, we could do this, but oh my gosh, if we do this, forget about it. Like the conspiracy theories will run crazy then, and we don't want to live in that kind of world. We'll see how this all plays out, but in the meantime, some governments are experimenting with the private provision of digital currency and attended questions over privacy and data surveillance. So, in China, those attendant questions maybe are muted. In Sweden, those questions led that country to push pause on its plans for a central bank digital currency, at least for now. Now, while cryptocurrency proponents and central banks debate among and between themselves the future of money, there are other alternatives. And I'm going to get very corny for the remainder of my talk, and I apologize. But again, this is like in the spirit of thinking about some of the actually existing alternatives out there and dilating the space-time for them to do what they do. For the past several years, I've been heavily involved in research with and for the credit union movement. Credit unions, just a little refresher, are nonprofits. Their shareholders are their members. Their clients are the shareholders. Returns flow back to the members in the form of interest and in the form of better terms for loans and other services. They're cooperative at every level of scale, from their governance to the network of credit union servicing organizations and the alphabet soup, my colleague Taylor Nelms calls it, of regulatory and self-regulatory bodies that support them. They're an example of the profusion of relations and forms that actually exist in the world, astride digital naturalists or central bank authorities, if only we know whom to ask and where to look. Over the past couple of years, this was happening right before the pandemic, and then everything kind of stopped. I've been involved in conversations among credit unions to create collaborative data trusts, to use the trust structure, and think back to Talon and Lepine. They identified the trust as one of those epicycles on the free self-regulating market. Use trusts in a cooperative fashion for credit unions to pool member data across their entire network, and then to use that data in an analogous manner to how they use members' funds in support of their members and their members' interests, right? So don't use the data just to push them products on Amazon or to push them some new credit card, but figure out what the members' interests are, what uses they might put their data to, leverage the whole network's data, not just my little credit union, but the 1/3 in this country, 1/3 of American households that have a credit union account, put them all together, that's bigger than some of our big banks, use them to do something different. Don't know what that is yet, but this is sort of aligned with other analogous experiments with things like land trusts, providing another model for a datafied society that maybe will obviate or obfuscate surveillance capitalism. I'm also involved in another project that is just getting off the ground, and shout out to Melissa Rapp and Ellen Kladke and Jenny Fan, who are here, who are participating in this, called Community Credit Discovery, which is a project funded by the National Science Foundation together with some credit unions and some community-based organizations to enable community-based organizations to teach credit unions about the assets that they actually possess: community relationships, social networks, kinship, multifamily household resources, land owned de facto or in usufruct, identifying alternative assets that can then potentially feed into alternative forms of credit scoring, new credit products, loans to smooth seasonal income, and so forth. And we're talking about building co-creation panels, algorithmic observatories to help people track the kinds of online marketing for bad financial products they're getting, to then reverse engineer the algorithm and figure out why they're being targeted in such a way, and then even potentially to launch some, consumer protection papers or whatever, but also to build alternative products, loans, alternatives to credit scores. I don't want to make a huge, strong claim for these alternatives, but I do want to highlight what they offer. Rather than the miser's coddling, such cooperative arrangements throw themselves into the thick of the hurly-burly of interconnection, the messy and contingent social that so many crypto and tech would-be moguls seek to escape in the pure outer space worlds that deny everything but their own putative transcendence. The messy hurly-burly of the community meeting, counterposed to the NFTs transcendence and the miser's coddling. Cooperative models and collaborative infrastructures counterposed to CBDCs, which would represent a very forceful state re-intermediation in the stuff of money and our social relations. So I will end it there. I am interested to hear comments and reactions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Bill. That was amazing, actually. So, is your conclusion that the future is actually these cooperatives and credit unions? Because if we sort of rewind your talk a little bit, so we have the misers holding. They're libertarians who were initially attracted to Bitcoin. That never became a general purpose payment method. Instead, it had these unintended consequences. Silk Road and maybe international remittances, but obviously nobody's paying for their electronics or groceries using Bitcoin. And then, you were also talking about all these other, CBDC stuff, which is not going to take off because people are going to be too suspicious of governments. So is your conclusion that the future of digital currency is going to be some hybrid form, and it's going to be these kind of collectives like the credit unions? Or could we maybe talk about stable coins? Is that going to be a compromise and the new digital, payment future? Or what's your projection?
So my projection, so I have no crystal ball, and usually this is going to sound terrible. Usually people take the wrong turn, so I don't know what kind of hope I have for the cooperative model being the model of the future. All that I want to do, and that's why I said this is an intentionally modest claim, is to, when we're thinking about this future, at least hold in mind the space that cooperative and collaborative models of data governance in particular, and money and all of that give us. So if I can, as I said, if we can just expand that space-time a little bit, I think that might be useful to then have those alternatives at least at the table. Very pragmatically speaking, when people are drafting legislation to decide how a CBDC is going to work, or how a series of relief payments should be structured, right? If you look at the bits of the bank, so there was this thing called the Banking for All Act. It didn't happen. It was tied together with CARES. If you look at it, it's really, really great. Like all of a sudden, all these ideas about like universal basic income and central bank digital currencies specifically for relief payments was there. That's awesome. But that was it, right? So again, we're getting into that thing of we've got this sort of constrained set of tracks that we think along, and we can't think about all the other stuff happening in the meantime. So I want all that meantime stuff to be there. In terms of, you know, again, pragmatically, what might actually happen, you know, there will be CBDC things that will be released out there in the world. Maybe some of them will be stablecoin oriented, which like connects them nice and tight to state issued money and relieves some of the monetary policy questions that come up. Some of the questions around volatility are solved by that and so forth. But then I would want to bring in like the lesson from the cooperative movement to bring in there is how do we ensure that there's some kind of democratic governance over those systems, which we can do with our existing structures, right? You could easily have something like, what would you call, like a commission, right? Some sort of like democratically elected or appointed by democratically elected representatives commission to like sit alongside the Fed when it's doing its stablecoin. Some kind of more robust oversight mechanism than just like the OCC. Or, I mean, you know, again, this is the thing, like we have these things already, we just don't use them, right? Like we have the OCC, we just don't use it. We have antitrust, we just haven't used it. All of those things do what I would want in terms of my democratic oversight of everything. Will we use them? If we use them, will they become durable and sustainable in a way that they haven't been? And I'm sorry for the UK colleagues, this just became a very US centric kind of thing. But that's why, again, I at least want, when people are at the drawing board, I want them to have in mind, oh yeah, credit unions, oh wow. And again, just to think back to the early days of the pandemic, folks were up in arms about the huge profits that the big banks were making because of the shift to digital payment during the pandemic and because of relief money being distributed over debit card that was then charging people fees at the ATM. There was a huge outcry, and it took people from the credit union system to say, but not us, like we're not doing that. Right? We're not charging those high fees. Whatever things we do go back to the members. And then what happened, right? Then the banks one by one took down or eliminated some of those fees. So that's again what I mean by opening up that space for that alternative so that we can shake up things a little bit. But that was a great set of questions. Thank you for letting me expound.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Bill. So in the interest of keeping things on track, if you could please raise your hand in the chat here. And just before we go over to Nikki, who's raised his hand, a small technical correction, because it's been said before by Luke, that Bitcoin isn't used as a means of payment. Actually, technically speaking, that's not entirely true. In Japan, there is a network of 20,000 shops, I think it's 24,000, accepting Bitcoin as a means of payment. So I could walk into any of these shops and buy whatever they have to offer. So this being said, just a correction. This being said, Nikki. Hi.
Yes, thank you, Alex, and thank you for the very interesting presentation. On the kind of community data initiative, you know, with the credit unions that you discussed, I've been working with a couple of my colleagues on a project on open banking. I'm not sure whether it's as central an issue in the US as it is in Europe and in the UK. But what's interesting there is that it's kind of driven really by regulation, and the incumbent banks are sort of really kind of doing it as a kind of box ticking exercise. It's not very obvious if they get any kind of benefit from it whatsoever. And the idea is to sort of really stimulate sort of fintech innovation through, you know, this kind of trusted third-party use of the data of one bank with another bank and opening up APIs and so on. What was interesting with that was just to see, though, how much all of these people, whether on the incumbents and think it's going to be the sort of the end of a life as they know it, or whether it's in terms of all the innovation that the regulators assume that the fintechs will be able to make out of this. What actually sort of seems to be coming out of it is that it's actually, not that much has actually happened. And the challenges of sort of integrating data, even though there's some degree of standardization, is sort of hugely underestimated by all these people, whether seeing it as a negative or a positive kind of development. So I'm sort of wondering whether there's something different here with the credit unions that would do this in a different way. And then it led me sort of a little bit into a kind of observation a bit as well as about the credit unions and the hodling, because from what I've read from and heard from people who've done, again, colleagues who've done research on credit unions both in Ireland and in the US, one of the sort of in a sense they actually perform quite well compared to the banking system, but there is also sort of an issue about them not being able to invest and really having to sort of keep their money in the central bank, which is a kind of ultimate form of hodling, I guess. Would this sort of data-driven approach be able to kind of, I don't know, give more mobility to that money that the sort of credit unions are kind of constrained to keep at the central banks, which is kind of dead money in a sense? And sort of, this sort of whole idea of the hodling, it made me think I was in Assisi in Italy at the Cathedral of St. Francis, and they had an exhibition about the Franciscan view of money, and it was almost hodling was kind of the big sin. They weren't against interest rates, but they were against hodling and making the money work in society to enable people to do things with the money. And it's sort of, I guess it's sort of built into the whole sort of Christian democracy political economy of Europe as well. So I'm sort of wondering, I don't know if that fits in anywhere, but it's a kind of interesting kind of ethical element there as well coming into what you presented.
No, this is great. Thank you for that series of reflections. There's a whole bunch of things there. I mean, first on the open banking issue, there's not as much discussion here as there is there, again, because of the regulatory kind of demand over where you are to sort of make it happen, which is not here yet, although it's probably coming around questions of data portability and so forth, and opening up more space for the fintechs. But I think it's interesting that you said that it's happening there, but not much is really going on. And I think that it's still an open question as to, it's sort of an open question as to how anybody makes money in banking and fintech, period, right? So much of it, again, this is why I had my Mark Twain picture with the toll roads. So much of it was predicated on the idea of setting up new digital rails, that then you could charge a toll for use. That's the very traditional model. That's great until your regulator starts reducing the amount that you can charge, which is what's been happening on both sides of the Atlantic. So then what do you do? What you do then, at least so far, is you engage in the fantasy of data, right? Of kind of leveraging transactional data, which you now have more of, really getting into the kind of elimination of cash kind of discourse to capture also data from the world point of sale. So you're not just leveraging data from online and mobile transactions, but also physical world transactions too. People can stop using cash and use your payment app instead, then all of a sudden you've got all of that data too. And then some magical somehow turn that value into a revenue stream. And even though we live in this world all the time, it's still not really happening, right? I mean, it's happening kind of in an advertising and marketing sort of sense, but that's kind of it. I know there's people here who have heard me tell you before, but a number of years, I don't know if it was like at this point, 10 years, meeting with a group of people running a little fintech, and they were talking about how they were gathering all this transactional data and how exciting that was for them. And, it represented a whole new potential business model. And I said, okay, but what are you really going to do with it? Like, what do you imagine is your future? And the CEO just sort of said, well, frankly, we don't really know. We kind of imagine that it would just get bought by people, right? So in the data space, even though we talk about it all the time and it's in the business press all the time, it's still sort of an open question. The next thing that you raised, though, is very, very interesting to me and to the credit union conversation about data governance and data trust, because their data is just as much of a mess as everybody else's, right? So even getting to the point where it's possible to like put your data in a data trust is many, 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 many steps down the road to get there. Part of this is because a lot of credit unions don't run their own core systems. They're too small. So instead they use what are called core providers or credit union service organizations. Again, all part of that kind of cooperatively governed system, but it's another entity that doesn't necessarily share all the data back to the credit union. At a convening that we held right before the pandemic hit, this was like the #1 stumbling block, that people couldn't even get, the credit union couldn't even see all of its ACH transfer data, all of the sort of direct bill pay or direct deposit data. They couldn't even see all of that back from their core. So the kind of data trust thing has to start from a prior space of developing new organizational models, right, to even have it happen. So, one of the things that I always say to the credit unions about technology stuff is, it's not really about the tech, it's about your organizational model. And we need new organizational forms even to get to the step of sharing data to then put it in a trust to then leverage it to do something productive for members. And then finally, I love the kind of, the kind of reflections on, medieval and Renaissance stuff. I don't really know what to do with it, but it's great. And I love thinking about it and looking at some of those sort of case studies of what folks were actually doing in those sorts of systems that were, organized around precious metal very often, but also, all kinds of letters of credit that the church extended to far-flung people in nations all over the place, like California. There's Southern California, the Huntington Library that has some of that material. I've never, sort of these letters of credit and stuff with the missions that were here, I've never dug into it, but it's just like a wide open thing for someone to tackle someday.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks, Nikki, for the very interesting bunch of questions. Now I have another one here in the chat box coming from Maxence Dutilleul from Paris, and she asks the following: the introduction of CBDCs could potentially totally reorganize the relations between central banks and commercial banks, especially if it will be possible to open deposit accounts directly to the central bank, so in case of financial instability, risks of bank run. Do you know how do commercial banks react to this project of CBDCs? Was there any public or unofficial reaction? And how did providers of stablecoins react?
So the commercial banks, as you might expect, are worried about this, right? Are like, wait a minute, like this will suck for us. And there's been some really great work on the potential impact on commercial banks of the CBDC by the Bank of England. So if you're interested in this specific topic, there's a bunch of really good Bank of England reports. I'm trying to remember the first name of what's his name. Michael Kumhoff, isn't that his name? Yes, here, let me put this in the chat. I like this guy's work. But then this discussion that's taking place between central bank people thinking about it and commercial bank people thinking about it really goes, I think, to a useful place, which is if you're so scared, then maybe you should provide better services. Right? Like a lot of the discussion turns into in such a way that everybody has the potential to have access to an account at the central bank. this would probably just be a bare bones account. In this country, there's been talk of linking it to the post office, so using the post office network as the channel. We don't have postal banking right now, we used to, so there's a lot of discussion about bringing it back and tying it to this idea of accounts of the central bank. It would be kind of like the public option, right? The public option for banking and payment. And so the discussion between commercial banks and central banks about that is, if it's a public option, then your non-public option just has to be better or have features that will drive me to choose you instead of the bare bones post office banking account, right? Which then, if you're, a old hoary sclerotic banking organization, right? It's like, what? Innovate? I don't know how to innovate. Why should I innovate when I take people's money and then charge them interest, and that's how I make my money, and I've been doing it for years and years and years. So there is this sort of talk that this might propel some innovation in banking. But on the whole, they're freaked out. Commercial banks are freaked out at the possibility, and will try to kill it. Interestingly, the legacy payment providers like Visa have come in saying, don't worry, everything will be fine. We will help you. We have historically been the intermediary linking banks together in ways that allow for consumer-facing payment options. We'll keep doing that for you, commercial bank, whether it's people using money in their CBDC account or in your account. We'll still be there. We'll be facilitating it. You'll still get interchange and other fees somehow. Fear not. So Visa has put out some interesting papers if you want to take a look at those. What's I don't know what to think about this yet. But if you look at what they're proposing, it looks a lot like the way that the current Chinese CBDC experiment looks, where there's the assumption that the CBDC, that the central bank works with a private provider of e-money that then uses a next provider of the payment rails. For reasons I don't quite understand. I don't understand how it works in China. So I've been trying to think about that and figure that out. What was the other? Oh, the stablecoin people. So, I have to say, there's been more regulatory concern and attention to stablecoin projects. And I still don't myself understand quite why, because a stablecoin looks a lot like e-money under the EU Payment Service Directives 1 and 2. So I kind of don't get what the big deal is. It looks like it functions a lot like any kind of prepaid thing. So I don't know how they're reacting, and I can't really say much more about it, but I'd be interested if anyone has that expertise and wants to jump in.
Right.
And I see Vivian Jokodo has put in Ghana, the plan for the ESETI is for people to open their accounts through commercial banks. Okay, so I don't know if Vivian, if you want to jump in, but you open the account through the commercial bank, but it would be denominated in a CBDC.
Yes, that's the plan of the central bank. Yeah.
Great. So any other questions we might have here? Let me try and shift the discussion to something more theoretical. Bill, in anthropology and in sociology as well, I'm speaking as a sociologist. We had over the past decades a lot of discussions around money, sociology of money, anthropology of money, nature of money, and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering whether with the advent of NFTs, stable coins, tokens, CBDCs, this and that, because new forms of coins and tokens are popping up all the time, whether it's time to shift the focus back to some, classic staple from anthropology, namely barter. So is this conceptual notion of money in sociology and anthropology running out of steam, being sort of overhauled by reality, so that we need to go back to concepts which we neglected to a certain extent for a long time? So shall we go back, to put it simply, shall we go back to the coloring and update Malinowski?
Of course, I love the question. And you know, kind of, yeah, right? I mean, and some of the co-op and credit union stuff, I think, helps me think through that, right? Opening up into communities of relationships defined by some kind of field of membership, the way that they talk about it in the credit union system, which is supposed to be a kind of a community stitched together by different forms of regard for one another, which like sounds like hula and stuff. But getting to that thing of, do we need to overhaul the whole thing? That's why I think I said this at one point in the talk when I was extemporaneizing, that, you know, I get frustrated with myself because I hear myself argue with NFT proponents I hear myself speaking neoliberalism, right? I'm like, wait, no, money is supposed to be a universal equivalent that makes all things fungible and da-da-da. And then I'm like, wait, no, there's earmarking and sequestering, and, you know, Viviana Zelizer and Jen Geyer taught us all of that already. So I get in this little thing with myself. But that's also why I led off with the Calon Lepene, right? It's really useful to just remember, okay, yeah, the self-regulating market never really was, and we've had to invent all of these things to try to tell a story that fits in with the kind of dominant narratives of economies of capitalist markets. So fine, but I think you're absolutely right that this occasions a rethink of all that stuff. It also occasions, I mean, for me, I've been really going back into kind of political theory, like democratic theory, right? Like I've been reading Dewey. How do we kind of imagine these sorts of institutions and systems in a world where, you know, there might be like private currencies, in a world where there might be, what would you call it? Like little eddies, little captured bits that are controlled entirely by one private issuer of money, who then controls the gateway to the other kind of eddy of another kind of money. You know, that's how you know, if you look at kind of China and think about the Chinese internet, right? There's an analog right there in terms of the free flow of information. We have these sort of, this little, I mean, it's not little, it's gigantic, but this kind of bubble, side bubble thing. How do we think about that when we think about kind of economies? And then that opens up all of those classic good old economic anthropology questions of, you know, what are the forms of transfer among them? What are the kind of translations between them that you get from the work of someone like a Jane Geyer? So I think it's a great question. And, you know, the thing that also has always fascinated me is that a lot of the kind of crypto people who are kind of theorizing it as they go along also go back to some of that stuff, right? And it's interesting and irritating at the same time to have someone tell me something about, like, you know, Yap or Yap money, or tell me something about, like, did you hear there are these people and they had these shells and one went in one direction, the other went in the other direction. I'm like, yes, but stop. That's also, you know, I've sort of written about this in the past. It's really interesting that so many people in that space will pick up David Graeber, right? And like use Graeber to think through what they're doing. That's really interesting. So anyhow, I'll just put it. I see that there's a Luke has another question. I'm trying to follow the chat, but I think we're all caught up in the chat right now.
Sure. Yeah, I did raise my hand this time. So I have a question about use cases for NFTs and Metaverses, since you have talked about that. And let me give you some context for my question. So I used to teach a blockchain course at Berkeley, you know, next door. And if the students were not constrained, and I would tell them create an enterprise or a startup based on the blockchain tech, they would create two kinds of apps, right? One was food delivery and the second one was hookup apps. I'm like, no, let's not do that. I constrained it and I said social impact. That was just incredibly, you know, creative what they did. Like, one group of students created a way to disintermediate bail because the governor wanted to do away with it. They said, let's create an algorithm to figure out flight risk. Let's do peer-to-peer sourcing of bail funds so that somebody can, you know, stay out of jail. Got it really cool. So now I'm going to teach a course on NFTs and Metaverses. What would you think would be a good, you know, set of constraints for NFTs and Metaverses I thought about, I mean, obviously they're going to do gaming, right? So there's going to be a group of students who are going to do gaming, but then social impacts in healthcare. I was wondering about healthcare in particular, if that's a good use case for NFTs and metaverses from your sort of anthropologist perspective, or if you can think of an even better one for, you know, challenging students. What can you tokenize? You know, what can you make digital?
Yeah, what can you tokenize and why, right? And the health thing is really interesting. So, you know, one thing that you might do is even point them to either, and this is again going to sound very US centric, but point them to like existing regulations around things like, I can't remember what it's called, well, around pharmaceuticals. There's an act that was passed under Obama that still hasn't been implemented. It's like the Drug Supply Chain Security Act or something that's supposed to allow traceability, right, from factory to pill that I pop in my mouth. That would be really great, right? If you had that kind of verifiability, so you're not having like counterfeit drugs or impurities introduced along the way or something that's not just dealing with the vial, right? Right now, there are systems with these little glass vials. I don't know if you've ever seen this. Little glass vials on the bottom, they have a QR code etched on them. And that's how we track the things going through the pharmaceutical like supply chain. But it's a whole bunch of stuff in there. It's not like one pill. It's a whole bunch of stuff. Like it's poured into some other thing. And I obviously have never seen this, like except pictures of it, and so I don't know how it works. But that's something, right? There are other kind of supply chain oriented traceability systems where having a kind of physical world commodity simultaneously born digital would be useful. So anything having to do with, you know, fair trade, no slave labor, you know, whatever, regenerative agriculture, there's a whole bunch of stuff there that would be really interesting to look at. The other thing too, you know, in terms of bridging worlds, would be anything having to do with energy, right? That would be kind of fun. Those are the things that just come to mind immediately, to have it not instantly be like evil or just like capitalism. I mean, you know, the obvious thing that I don't understand why. I mean, I understand why it hasn't happened. It's because NFTs happened. Everyone's like, ooh, NFTs, let's buy them and make millions. But you know, the NFT idea like is an old idea in blockchain land from what's his name, the guy who invented Monograph, right? He was like an NYU professor who was like, blockchain will be great for digital rights management, and then came up with a way to do it. And then Imogen Heap did her thing with Ujo, which was sort of cool. But then it never went anywhere, and instead you get kind of speculative frenzy over NFTs. So those were projects that basically would allow our artists of various kinds to have the work itself in a blockchain, so that then if someone sampled or copied, there would be an automatic micropayment back to the artist, in my understanding. I see that Lilith has put her physical hand up, so I don't know if you want to jump in on this point.
Just wanted to ask. Sorry, I wanted to ask another question.
Oh, okay. Well, Luke, that's what I got for now.
That's awesome.
If I think of anything else, I can send you a note maybe.
No, it's great. I think the artistic one is also interesting. And by the way, the supply chain one, so my sort of day job and my employer, those are the actual deployments of the blockchain tech, is tracking the supply chain, including for the tantalum, right, which is in all the you know, iPhones, right?
Right. That's a good one.
Conflict mineral, and people want to be able to prove that no slave labor was involved. So those are actually paying customers. So that's a good example. Thank you so much for answering my question.
Absolutely. Lilith, go ahead.
So thank you both for your talk. I wanted to ask, so if I understand you correct, you kind of started out with Polanyi, who was talking about these waves, how sort of social society tries to find a way to sort of fight against capitalism. And then you're saying, okay, after the financial crisis, there was Bitcoin, and people were sort of trying to get money back into their hands. But then for me, I wonder, isn't the question of being against the state, which is sort of the original idea of Bitcoin, and which is also encrypted in the first, or against the banks, isn't that something else than being against capitalism? So I was, yeah.
No, I see. Yeah, for Polanyi, for Polanyi, the state is sort of the manifestation of society come back to kind of put some rails around the market after periods of market excess. And in this case, quite explicitly, it's anti-state, it's anarchist in orientation and so forth. So that's a great sort of correction to the way that I was presenting it with Polanyi. To me, what's interesting is, so for the Polanyi, well, like the weird thing is, you have those anarchist tendencies in government now, right? You have like people who espouse that stuff. You've had it for a while in this country too, for people who want to, eliminate the state, even as they are also like grifting off of the state, turning kind of state operations into a grift for private gain. So yeah, no, that's super useful, and I want to kind of think through that. That's also why, again, I said, I don't think I have it here next to me. I've been reading Dewey, which is really weird to read these sort of, American pragmatists again in light of now. And he has all of this stuff about how sort of disassociating the idea of democracy from the idea of the state, and thinking of the idea of democracy as part of everyday practice, and that too often in the United States, democracy and liberty get linked in this way where it's about, like, liberty is like freedom from the state telling me what to do, instead of liberty being the freedom of me to engage in democratic practice with people around me. And like, we don't even know what that looks like, right? Because we're sort of not used to thinking in those terms. But that's also why even though it's super corny, that's why I love all the ways that credit unions represent themselves, right? It's all the like holding hands and like groups of people together doing whatever they're doing, right? Like humans together doing a thing, which is kind of great to think with and to think about. And again, that's why I'm interested in, in this project that we're engaged in, this community credit discovery thing. It's really going to be all about creating spaces for those kinds of interactions. But thank you. And I see that something is happening in the chat on your question too, which I'm not paying attention to. So thank you, Taylor.
Nikki, do you have another question? Or
yes, Alex, it was actually triggered by your question about barter, and I think what Bill said about how some of these things have already been done in the past, and I'm just sort of thinking of things like swaps, in effect, the corporate world's kind of form of barter initially. That's what swaps kind of came up from. And then I'm sort of looking at sort of technology and how that can change some kind of previous kind of past experiments in the 19th century, for example, with some of the comptabilist experiments in social money by sponsored by the Belgian industrialist Solvay, and which was a kind of I guess a capitalist version of the attempts by the Soviet central bank to abolish money in the early Soviet times as well. And thinking actually how, with technology now, all of these kind of so-called kind of primitive kind of ways of exchange actually become very, very doable in a sense. And this could be a different way to go with sort of cryptocurrencies, with smart contracts and so on. I mean, I was thinking probably, if the Soviet central bank in 1920, 21, 22, whenever it was, had the kind of computing power we had now, they could actually probably have abolished money and have a system based on accounting, purely accounting. It just struck me, in a sense that, maybe the technology is allowing us to sort of reinvent wheels that kind of didn't work the first time around.
Yeah.
So
it makes me think of, I don't know if Taylor Nelms is still here. I see him, but it makes me think, Taylor, Nikki's comment of that novel that you had me read about the former Soviet Union, that I forget what it's called. Where help my brain.
Yeah,
It
you're
goes
thinking
into
of
the kind
Francis. You're thinking
ahead.
of Francis Spufford, the Red Plenty, right?
Red Plenty, that's it. Which goes into kind of the imagination of these sort of Soviet accounting systems for centralization of everything, and the sort of has fictionalized people navigating this world kind of without money, but kind of with money. It's a lot of fun. Thank you, Taylor, for helping my brain. Luke, is your hand up again, or is it just still up? Okay.
Well, if do we have so one final question, perhaps, if anybody wants to intervene? If not, we should extend our warmest thanks to Bill for giving us the opportunity of this wonderful conversation. So it's a very nice closing of our seminar series for this term. We'll be back from January with a new program, and this time in the new program, I should announce it already. I have suggested that we bring in both academics from law, social sciences, and computer science, as well as practitioners. So next time we are going to have a couple of people from the industry coming, blockchain industry, coming to speak in our colloquium. We want to hear their viewpoints as well. So this being said, we will disseminate the program in due time. It's almost finalized, but not yet there. And let me close this session by thanking against you, Bill, for your wonderful talk. A lot of food for thought in your talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Excellent,
you.
very
Thank
interesting.
you so much. Thanks, Alex. Thanks to everyone for attending and for your questions, and good cheer, and have a great day or evening, wherever you are.
Hopefully we'll be able to welcome you in person in London in the near future.
Sounds good. I'll come. I'll bring my umbrella and my coat and my sweater and all the other things.
Well, it's not so cold. Well, today it is.
Yes.
Yeah, but.
Okay. Thanks again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. Bye-bye.